Okay, let's dive into a document that really grapples with something we all experience. That mix of joy and hope, right alongside grief and anguish.
Hmm.
You've ever felt that tension of the weight of the world's problems, things like conflict, poverty, division, but at the same time, you see incredible progress, new possibilities, maybe even a feeling of connection growing. Well, this deep dive is definitely going to speak to you.
Yeah, that very tension, that sense of paradox, and just really rapid change, that's exactly where our source material kicks off today.
Right.
We're looking at excerpts from Gaudium at Spes, which, translates from Latin to joy and hope. And this is a hugely significant document. It came out of the Second Vatican Council, that major global meeting the Catholic Church held back in the 1960s.
Okay, Vatican II. And what makes this one, Gaudium et Spes, stand out? Because, Vatican II covered a lot of ground, but this one had a particular focus, didn't it?
It really did. While some other documents from the council might have looked more inward, at the church itself, Gaudium et Spes uh, deliberately turned its gaze outward.
Outward. How so?
It was written to the modern world and really about the modern world. It tackled the big questions people were asking back then and, frankly, questions we're still asking about, well, humanity's place in a fast-changing world, our hopes, our struggles.
Gotcha. So our mission today is to take key parts of this outward-looking document, and sort of unpack them.
Hmm.
We want to pull out the key insights, maybe some perspectives that might surprise you, just to give you a clearer picture of this particular viewpoint on, well, the modern human condition. And we're working straight from the text of Gaudium et Spes itself. Ready to jump in?
Absolutely. Let's do it. So the document starts by laying out the church's kind of fundamental approach when engaging with the world.
Okay.
It says the church has this duty to scrutinize the signs of the times and interpret them in the light of the gospel.
Scrutinize the signs of the times.
Yeah, and it's not just about like abstract theology or academic study. It's a call to be really present in the world, aware of all its complexities, and to engage with the real questions people are asking about what life means today.
That phrase, signs of the times, feels really active, like looking at current events, trends, culture shifts, and trying to figure out what's really going on underneath.
Precisely. And right after establishing that duty, the document just launches into this description of the modern world as they saw it back in the 60s. And what's pretty fascinating is how many of these descriptions still feel incredibly relevant.
It paints a picture full of paradoxes, right? That's what jumps out.
Oh, stark paradoxes, yeah. It notes that, humanity had gained unprecedented wealth, incredible technical power, economic might.
Hmm.
But at the very same time, a huge portion of the world was still suffering from hunger, poverty, illiteracy. The potential for abundance was there, clear as day, yet desperate need was just as real.
That gap, that disconnect between what we can do and what the reality is. Yeah, we're still wrestling with that globally, aren't we?
Definitely. And then there's the whole dimension of freedom.
Okay.
The document observes this heightened sense of personal freedom, of autonomy, people feeling more independent than ever. But it also points to the rise of new forms of social and psychological servitude.
Wow. New forms of servitude, even with more freedom.
Think about it. A greater sense of freedom, maybe, but perhaps new, less obvious ways people feel constrained or controlled or even trapped, socially or psychologically.
That's a really powerful thought, especially when you think about like modern society, technology, social pressures.
Exactly. And then there's the global unity piece, this
Yeah.
growing interdependence where, the fate of humanity feels more and more
Yeah,
connected.
you feel that.
The document sees that. It acknowledges it's real. But then it's immediately countered by these intense divisions, political, social, economic, ethnic, ideological conflicts everywhere. There's this pull towards unity and at the same time this push towards fragmentation with the constant shadow of potentially devastating war hanging over it all.
So it's not just that the world is changing, it's changing fast and in these really contradictory ways.
Exactly right. The document even highlights that history itself seems to be speeding up. It talks about a shift from a more static view of the world to a dynamic and evolutionary one. And this sheer speed makes it hard for people to keep pace. It creates disorientation, new problems that need constant rethinking.
What about just like social connections? The world was already getting more connected back in the 60s.
Oh, yeah. Things like urbanization, people moving around more, new media technologies.
Hmm.
These were already increasing human interactions, leading to what the document calls socialization. more contact, bigger networks.
Okay, more contact. But does that automatically mean, deeper connection, better relationships?
Well, the document kind of implicitly asks that question. It notes that this increased socialization doesn't necessarily lead to deeper personalization, which means like the maturing of the individual person and forming genuinely profound personal bonds. It raises that challenge. How do we foster real human connection when our social structures are getting so complex?
That definitely hits home today with, digital connections, tons of links, maybe not always the same depth.
Absolutely. It also touches on generational shifts.
Oh, yes.
Changes in how society is structured, changes in thinking. These lead to clashes over inherited values, especially with younger generations. The document notes young people often want to participate in social life earlier, which can sometimes look like impatience or rebellion, making things harder for parents and educators.
And how does religion fit into this picture of rapid change?
It's deeply affected. The document sees on one hand a more critical approach, filtering faith from, say, magic or superstition. For some people, this actually leads to a deeper, more authentic awareness of God. But for many others, it leads to drifting away from religious practice altogether, or even an outright rejection of religion. And what's new, the document points out, is that this rejection is often framed as a requirement of scientific progress or humanism. This creates a lot of internal confusion for people trying to navigate faith in the modern world.
That sounds like a very accurate picture of faith trying to find its place in a more secular world. And all these shifts, internal and external, they must create a real sense of imbalance.
They absolutely do. The document talks about imbalances within the individual person, like between practical thinking and theoretical reason, or between efficiency and conscience, or individual thought versus the demands of the community, or specialized knowledge versus trying to see the whole picture. And these internal imbalances then show up in society. Difficulties within families, tensions between classes or ethnic groups, the huge gap between rich and poor nations, and that constant struggle between international bodies trying to foster peace and the narrower national ambitions of individual states.
Right. And amidst all this change and tension, the document also sees expectations rising.
Yeah, a really urgent rise in expectations. There's this demand for resources that people feel are being unjustly denied. There's a desire from developing nations to participate fully politically and economically. There's a call for aid for the poor, a push for real equality for women legally and in practice. Workers and farmers longing for dignity and participation, not just bare survival, and this growing, almost universal belief that the richness of culture should be available to everyone.
Wow. That initial snapshot of the world is incredibly detailed and, honestly, pretty intense, full of contradictions, rapid change, deep questions. As you hear that picture from the 1960s, what parts really jump out as still resonating with your experience of the world today? It's kind of amazing how some fundamental tensions haven't really changed much.
It really is striking. And this intense look at the world sets the stage, because the document's next big focus is on the human person who has to live within this complex reality.
Right, which takes us to a really core theme. The dignity of the human person. Where does Gaudium et Spes say this dignity comes from? What's its foundation?
The document grounds human dignity firmly in its theological understanding. It states that humans are created in the image of God and are guided by the Holy Spirit. This belief, this foundation, is what sheds light on the whole picture of what it means to be human, and it provides a basis for tackling our deepest problems.
So dignity isn't something we earn or that society gives us, it's inherent.
Exactly. And it applies to the whole person. The document really emphasizes that humans are a unity of body and soul. The body isn't, something lesser or bad. It's good. It deserves respect. And it connects us to the material world, a world we're actually called to care for and offer back to God.
But it also acknowledges that internal struggle, right? It's not overly idealistic.
No, it's very realistic on that front. Because of sin, it says, there's this kind of internal rebellion within each person. So the call is to honor God with our entire being, body and soul, and to resist those inclinations towards evil. It's a holistic view, acknowledges both the fundamental goodness and the reality of internal disorder.
It also seems to place a high value on human reason.
Very much so. The dignity of reason is highlighted. It's seen as participating in divine light, in God's own understanding. Reason is what allows us to understand the world, to make scientific and technological progress, and importantly, to grasp reality beyond just what's on the surface, beyond mere appearances. Even though sin weakens us, reason still holds this profound capacity.
And freedom and responsibility are also central to this dignity, I imagine.
Absolutely. The document talks about free will being given right from the beginning, though sadly misused. And it repeatedly brings up conscience, that inner voice, that guide that helps us discern what's right, understand our obligations, and make moral judgments in real-life situations. Conscience is seen as vital for acting in a way that reflects our dignity.
But as you mentioned, the document doesn't paint a naive picture. It confronts the reality of sin head-on as a disruptive force.
Oh, definitely. Sin is presented as this fundamental break, this rebellion against God. And this doesn't just mess up our relationship with God, it distorts our relationship with ourselves, with other people, and with the whole of creation.
It affects everything.
It goes further, actually. It says sin corrupts human activity itself. Even our good intentions, our best efforts, can become ambiguous or tainted by pride or self-love. It's presented as a really pervasive issue that touches everything we try to do.
And in this context, dealing with human reality, the document specifically takes on modern atheism.
It does, and quite extensively. It tries to understand different forms of it, particularly the kind that links human liberation, especially economic and social progress, directly with rejecting religion.
Okay, how so?
This view sees religion as an obstacle, basically, offering, a false hope in some future world while actually holding back progress in this world. The document even notes that some governments at the time actively promoted atheism, sometimes using oppressive methods, especially targeting the education of young people.
That's a very specific diagnosis of a certain kind of atheism prevalent then. What's the church's response according to the document?
Well, it says the church, sadly but firmly, condemns these doctrines and actions. It sees them as contrary to basic reason and common human experience and ultimately degrading to human dignity. But importantly, it also stresses that the church tries to understand the hidden roots, the underlying reasons why people embrace atheism, recognizing it as a serious issue to grapple with.
So it's condemnation, but paired with an effort to understand the why.
Exactly. And it offers a counter-argument. It says, acknowledging God is not opposed to human dignity. In fact, true human dignity is founded on God. And having hope for a future life doesn't diminish our commitment to earthly duties. If anything, it can give them a deeper meaning and motivation.
Okay, so that's the argument. But what does Gaudium et Spes suggest is the most effective way to respond to atheism in practice?
Beyond just explaining doctrine clearly, it points to the life of the church and its members as the most powerful answer.
The lived experience.
Precisely. This means cultivating a faith that's alive, that actively engages with life's real difficulties. It means giving witness through actions, through justice, through genuine charity, especially towards those who are poor or suffering. And it means visibly showing unity among believers. These lived examples, the document argues, are the most compelling response to skepticism.
And even with this strong stance against atheistic doctrines, is there still room for cooperation?
Absolutely. The document concludes this section with a really sincere invitation to all people, believers and non-believers alike, to work together to build a better world. It explicitly condemns any discrimination based on belief and demands effective freedom for believers to live their faith openly and contribute to society.
That's quite a nuanced approach, holding firm to its beliefs while actively seeking common ground and cooperation. When you think about this whole picture of the human person created with dignity, struggling with sin, gifted with reason and freedom, navigating a world where faith is often challenged, how does that resonate or compare with other viewpoints you've come across? It certainly provides a rich, if complex, framework.
It really does. It's a theological framework for sure, but one that's deeply engaged with the messy realities of our inner lives and the external challenges we face. And this focus on the individual person naturally flows into how the document sees us living together.
Right, which brings us to the section on human community and social life. How does the document frame our basic need for community? Is it just nice to have or essential?
Oh, it's presented as absolutely essential. The document states that humans are fundamentally social beings. We weren't created to be solitary, we were created for unity. So social life isn't just like a helpful add-on, it's necessary for our personal growth, for developing our talents, for fulfilling our potential. It's through interacting with others, serving each other, engaging in dialogue, that we become fully human.
So community is baked into our development.
Exactly. And while it acknowledges there can be dangers in social life, it also highlights the benefits of socialization. Things like strengthening our personal qualities and being better able to defend our rights together.
And this leads to thinking about interdependence on a larger scale.
Yes, because as we become more interconnected globally, the idea of the common good, also has to expand. It becomes increasingly universal.
Okay, the common good. That's a key concept. How does Gaudium et Spes define it?
It gives a really important definition. It says the common good is the sum of those conditions of social life, which allows social groups and their individual members relatively thorough and ready access to their own fulfillment.
Okay, conditions allowing fulfillment.
Yeah, and it stresses that every group, every individual, has to think beyond their own needs. We have to consider the needs and legitimate aspirations of other groups, and ultimately the welfare of the entire human family.
And human dignity is still the bedrock here in social life.
Absolutely central. The document keeps coming back to it. The dignity of the human person transcends everything else. And flowing directly from this dignity are rights and duties that are universal and inviolable. They can't be taken away.
Does it list specific rights?
It does. It mentions basic needs like food, clothing, housing, the right to choose your state in life freely, including founding a family, the right to education, to employment, to a good reputation, to respect, to appropriate information, the right to act according to your own conscience, protection of privacy, and due freedom, including religious freedom. It's a pretty comprehensive list.
That's quite a foundation for a just society, rooted in dignity. How does this translate into how we should actually treat other people day to day?
Well, there's a very strong emphasis on respecting every single person as another self, especially when it comes to ensuring they have what they need for a dignified life. The document uses that stark gospel image of the rich man completely ignoring Lazarus, the poor man at his gate, as a prime example of failing this duty.
Yeah, that's a powerful image.
And it calls being a neighbor to everyone in need an urgent duty today. It specifically mentions the elderly, foreign workers, refugees, children born outside marriage, the hungry. It explicitly connects serving them to serving Christ himself, quoting Matthew 25. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.
So active concern for others is non-negotiable, and it also condemns actions that go against this dignity.
Very clearly and strongly, the document lists what it calls infamous actions. These include things directly contrary to life itself: murder, genocide, abortion, euthanasia, willful self-destruction. Then things that violate the integrity of the person, like mutilation, physical or mental torture, trying to coerce someone's mind. And finally, things that offend human dignity through degrading conditions, subhuman living conditions, arbitrary imprisonment, deportation, slavery, prostitution, trafficking in women and children, disgraceful working conditions where people are treated as mere tools for profit.
That's a heavy list.
It calls these actions an infamy that poisons human society, dishonors the Creator, and stains those who commit them more than those who suffer the injustice.
Wow. But this call for respect, it even extends to people we fundamentally disagree with, people with opposing views.
Yes, interestingly, it does. The document calls for respect and charity, even towards those who think or act differently in social, political, or religious matters. The idea is that charity helps us understand them better, even if we don't agree, and makes dialogue easier.
But does that mean compromising on truth?
No, it clarifies that. Charity doesn't mean being indifferent to truth and goodness. In fact, it says love itself should compel us to speak the truth. But it makes a crucial distinction. We must reject the error, but always respect the dignity of the person who is in error. It reminds us that only God can judge the inner heart, the inner guilt.
That's a difficult balance, and it even includes the command to love enemies.
Explicitly. It brings up Christ's teaching to forgive injuries, to love our enemies, to do good to those who hate us, and to pray for those who persecute us, citing the Sermon on the Mount.
Okay, so this inherent dignity leads naturally to the idea of fundamental equality among people.
Exactly. The document asserts this fundamental equality. Yes, people differ in physical power, intellectual abilities, moral capacities, but underneath all that, we all share the same basic nature. A rational soul created in God's image. We have the same origin, we're all redeemed by Christ, and we all have the same divine calling and destiny.
So differences don't negate equality.
Right. Therefore, it concludes, any kind of discrimination based on sex, race, color, social condition, language, or religion is contrary to God's intent and must be overcome and eliminated as regrettable. It even gives a specific example relevant then, and sadly still relevant now. Women being denied the right to freely choose a husband or access education and culture on par with men.
So equality is rooted deep in our shared humanity.
Absolutely. And paragraph 30 connects this directly to a crucial social obligation, especially in our rapidly changing world. It argues that a purely individualistic ethic just isn't enough anymore.
Why?
Because justice and love demand that everyone contributes to the common good according to their ability. We need to support the institutions, public and private, that help improve human living conditions. It actually criticizes those who might profess grand ideas about humanity, but then ignore their basic social obligations, like paying taxes or following safety laws, essentially disregarding the needs of society.
So social responsibility is key.
It calls viewing our social relationships and duties as a sacred obligation today, particularly as global interdependence grows our global responsibilities. The document suggests that building a new humanity actually requires cultivating moral and social virtues, which allows us, with God's grace, to become new men, capable of building that better world.
That's a powerful vision, building a new humanity through shared responsibility. And does the document point to Jesus himself as a model for this kind of social engagement?
Yes, definitely. It emphasizes that God didn't just create individuals in isolation. He created humanity for unity, forming them into a people. And Jesus himself chose to enter this human society. He lived a common life, used everyday social realities in his teaching, sanctified human relationships like marriage and family, obeyed the laws of his country, worked with his hands, commanded his followers to treat each other as brothers, prayed for unity, and ultimately sacrificed himself for everyone. He's presented as the ultimate example of being deeply engaged in the social fabric.
Now, within the social fabric, the family gets special attention in Gaudium and Spes.
It really does. There's a significant section dedicated just to marriage and family. It starts by saying that the well-being of the individual person and of society is closely linked to the healthy state of marriage and family life.
But it doesn't ignore the problems families were facing then, right?
Not at all. It's quite candid, actually. It lists various issues that were obscuring the dignity of marriage around the world. Things like polygamy, the plague of divorce, so-called free love, misunderstandings about marital love and its purpose, even concerns about contraception. It also mentions economic, social, and psychological pressures, difficulties between generations, new questions about the relationship between men and women, and even concerns about population growth in some areas.
So it acknowledges the real-world pressures.
Yes, it says these things disturb consciences and deform the institution. Yet it also expresses confidence in the enduring strength of marriage, suggesting that sometimes social changes, paradoxically, help reveal its true nature more clearly, despite the obstacles.
How does it describe Christian marriage specifically?
It describes it as an intimate partnership, a covenant of love between a man and a woman, established by the Creator and governed by his laws. It's intended to be a symbol of Christ's own loving union with the Church, and it's seen as a sacrament, a source of grace that strengthens the couple for their duties as spouses and parents. This grace is meant to permeate their whole lives, even the ordinary parts, with faith, hope, and charity, helping them grow in holiness together and glorify God.
And the love within marriage. What does it say about that?
It describes marital love and the acts expressing it as noble and honorable when performed in a truly human way. They signify and nurture the mutual self-giving that enriches both partners. This love, it says, is uniquely expressed and perfected in the marital act itself. And strengthened by the sacrament, this love is intended to remain faithful in body and mind through good times and bad, and therefore free from adultery and divorce. It also links the equality of dignity between husband and wife to supporting this unbreakable unity.
It sounds like a high calling.
It acknowledges that. Fulfilling this calling demands eminent virtue, spiritual strength, and constant prayer for God's grace.
And family life isn't just seen in earthly terms.
No, the document reminds us that human life and the task of procreation aren't just limited to this world. They find their ultimate meaning and orientation towards our eternal destiny.
What about the family's role in education?
It calls the family a school for human enrichment. A thriving family requires kindness, mutual understanding between spouses, and parents working together diligently in educating their children. It highlights the importance of the father's presence and the specific role of the mother's care, especially for younger children, while also affirming that this shouldn't stop women from participating in society. Education within the family should prepare children for responsible freedom, helping them choose their path in life, whether marriage, religious life, or another vocation wisely. Parents should offer guidance, it says, but never pressure or coerce their children's choices.
And what about society's responsibility towards families?
The document sees the family as the foundation of society. Therefore, everyone who has influence, educators, public officials, social groups, has a duty to actively promote marriage and family life. The government, it says, has a sacred duty to recognize, protect, and foster the institution of marriage, to safeguard public morality, and to create conditions that support family well-being. This includes protecting the right of parents to have children and raise them within the family unit. And society needs to provide special protection and assistance for those who are vulnerable because they lack the support of a family.
And Christians have a particular role to play here.
Yes, Christians are urged to actively cultivate the values of marriage and family through the witness of their own lives and by cooperating with others of goodwill. They need to adapt to contemporary needs, guided by Christian principles, moral conscience, and the wisdom that comes from faith and sacred sciences.
Okay, so moving from the family unit to the broader concept of culture, how does Gaudium et Spes understand culture?
Culture is seen as fundamentally human, stemming from our reason and our social nature. It encompasses all the diverse ways people live, work, express themselves, practice religion, form moral codes, create laws, develop science and art. All these things result in distinct ways of life and systems of values. Culture also has a historical and social dimension. Think mass culture, and it's seen as a vital source of human development. We develop through culture.
And modern life was already bringing big changes to culture back then.
Oh, profound changes. The document talks about modern life creating a new age in human history, opening up new ways to develop and spread culture, especially through advances in science, technology, and communication.
What characteristics of this new cultural age did it identify?
It highlights things like a more critical way of judging things, deeper psychological insights, a stronger sense of history, a trend towards uniformity alongside globalization, the emergence of mass culture patterns, and increased exchange between different cultures, leading towards a more universal human culture while still emphasizing the need to respect diversity.
It seems to really stress the human role as the creator of culture.
That's a really key point. The document notes this growing awareness among people that they are the authors, the artists, the creators of their community's culture. This sense of autonomy and responsibility is seen as crucial for our spiritual and moral growth, especially for building a better world based on truth and justice. It even calls this the birth of a new humanism, one defined by our responsibility for each other and for the course of history.
So, while it surely saw challenges, it also identified positive aspects in modern culture.
Yes, definitely. It acknowledges difficulties, but also points to positive values emerging. Things like scientific rigor, the importance of collaboration in technical fields, growing international solidarity, a stronger sense of responsibility among experts, and this widespread desire to improve living conditions for everyone.
And how does faith fit into this cultural picture? How do they interact?
The document points out that God revealed himself within specific historical cultures. And the Church, throughout its history, has used the resources of diverse cultures to spread the gospel message, to understand it more deeply, and to express it in ways relevant to different peoples and times. So culture is seen as a necessary vehicle for articulating and living out faith.
What about freedom? Is cultural development dependent on freedom?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Culture needs proper freedom to flourish. The document argues that the government's role isn't to dictate specific cultural forms, but rather to foster the conditions that allow cultural life to thrive for everyone, including ethnic or social minorities. Culture shouldn't be manipulated or forced to serve political or economic agendas.
With the explosion of knowledge and specialization today, is it harder to be that well-rounded Renaissance person, the universal man?
The document acknowledges this difficulty. It sees the challenge in trying to synthesize all the different branches of knowledge and cultural elements today. However, it stresses that the essential task remains: to maintain the integrity of the human person, integrating our reason, will, conscience, and sense of brotherhood, an integrity ultimately rooted in God and elevated by Christ.
What about leisure time? Modern life often means more leisure for many people. How is that viewed?
It's seen quite positively. Increased leisure offers valuable opportunities for spiritual and physical renewal, for study, for travel, for cultivating relationships, and for fostering brotherhood through things like sports and cultural exchanges across different groups and nations. Christians, it says, should actively work to infuse modern cultural expressions and activities, including leisure, with a human and Christian spirit.
And the interaction between faith and culture even extends to the arts.
Yes. The document suggests that difficulties and challenges arising within culture can actually stimulate a deeper understanding of faith. New developments in science, history, or philosophy raise new questions that theology needs to engage with. It explicitly states the Church values artists and their freedom, and it encourages embracing new forms of art suitable for contemporary tastes and different regions, even within liturgical worship, as long as they are fitting, express the sacred appropriately, and lift people's hearts to God.
That section gives a really dynamic picture of faith engaging with the cultural currents of the time. As you think about your own cultural experiences, how do these ideas, seeing culture as human-created, valuable, something faith needs to interact with, how do they land with you? Do they resonate or maybe challenge your perspective?
Yeah, it definitely pushes you to think about being a conscious participant in culture, not just a passive consumer, to see its potential for expressing and even shaping our deepest values. And this idea of active engagement leads naturally into how we participate in the world through our work and economic life.
Right, which takes us to section 4, human activity in the world, covering work, the economy, property. How does Gaudium at Spes view the value of human work itself?
It sees human effort, things like science, technology, building global connections, all aimed at improving life as fundamentally good and aligned with God's plan. It references the biblical command to subdue the earth, interpreting it as a call for humanity to govern the world justly and direct creation towards God's purposes.
So work isn't just about making a living, it's seen as part of a divine mandate, almost.
In a sense, yes. And very importantly, the document stresses that work doesn't just change the external world. It perfects the person doing the work. Through work, we learn, we develop our talents, we literally transcend ourselves. This internal self-development is presented as more valuable than just accumulating external riches. In fact, it says actions aimed at achieving greater justice, brotherhood, and more humane social relationships are actually more valuable than purely technological advancements.
Okay, so if work has this deep value, what are the guiding principles, the norms, for evaluating human activity? How do we know if it's good activity?
The ultimate measure, according to the document, is whether our activity aligns with God's overall plan and serves the true well-being of the entire human race. Does it enable individuals and society as a whole to pursue and attain their full calling? That's the yardstick.
Now, the document also tackles a common worry. The idea that connecting earthly activities like science or economics too closely to religion might somehow undermine their independence or autonomy?
Yes, this is a really key point they address directly. Gaudium and Spes distinguishes between legitimate autonomy and a false kind.
Okay, what's legitimate autonomy?
Legitimate autonomy means recognizing that created things, and society itself, have their own inherent laws, structures, and values that humans are meant to gradually discover, use, and organize. This inherent order, it says, is actually willed by the Creator. Therefore, methodical scientific research, when conducted properly and respecting moral norms, will never truly conflict with faith, because the realities of the world and the realities of faith ultimately come from the same God. It actually regrets attitudes, sometimes found even among Christians, that misunderstand this legitimate autonomy and unnecessarily create conflict, making faith seem opposed to science.
So science and faith aren't seen as inherently opposed if autonomy is understood correctly.
Right, but then it defines false autonomy. This is the attitude that acts as if created things don't depend on God at all, as if we can use the world without any reference back to the Creator. The document uses a very stark phrase here. Without the Creator, the creature vanishes. It sees this denial of dependence as fundamentally flawed and ultimately self-destructive.
Okay. But even with this potential for good work and legitimate autonomy, human activity is still vulnerable. It can still go wrong.
Yes, the document circles back to the impact of sin. Sin introduces disorder into human activity, corrupting it. Overcoming this requires purification and perfection through the cross and resurrection of Christ. Redeemed by Christ, humans can then learn to love creation rightly, receive it from God with gratitude, and use it with detachment and spiritual freedom. In this way, paradoxically, they come to possess the world truly, being like those St. Paul described as having nothing and yet possessing everything.
And our activity finds its ultimate meaning and perfection in Christ.
Paragraph 38 explains this beautifully. It says, human activity, perfected throughout history, finds its consummation in the paschal mystery, the death and resurrection of Jesus. Christ, the Word made flesh, entered human history, embracing it and summing it up. He revealed that God is love and taught that charity, love of God and neighbor, is the fundamental law for human perfection and the transformation of the world. He showed that even our ordinary efforts towards universal brotherhood are not in vain, and his death and resurrection provide the ultimate hope and strength for this work.
This seems to powerfully connect our work here on Earth to a future hope.
It does, profoundly. The document talks about our hope for a new earth and a new heaven. We don't know the time or the manner of this transformation, but the teaching is that God is preparing a new dwelling place, a new earth where justice will reign. This future reality will fulfill all the deepest longings of the human heart for peace. It will conquer death, God's children will be raised, and creation itself will be freed from its bondage to decay.
But does this hope for a future world mean we should care less about this one? Does it devalue our efforts now?
Absolutely not. The document is very clear on this. Hope for a new Earth should not weaken, but rather stimulate our concern for cultivating this one. Why? Because earthly progress, it says, is a vital concern to the kingdom of God, insofar as it contributes to the better ordering of human society.
So our work here matters for the future kingdom. And do the good things we achieve here actually endure?
This is one of the most inspiring points in the whole document, I think. It says that the good fruits of our nature and our enterprise, things like human dignity, fellowship, freedom, all the good results of our efforts that we spread here on earth in the Spirit of the Lord, we will find them again in the new creation. But they will be cleansed, purified, transfigured when Christ hands over the eternal and universal kingdom to the Father. A kingdom, it says, of truth and life, holiness and grace, justice, love, and peace.
Wow, that idea that our best efforts here, the good we build, actually have an eternal significance, that they're not lost, that's incredibly powerful, that gives such meaning to everyday work. And building on this, the document then applies these high-level principles very concretely to socioeconomic life.
Exactly. The section on socioeconomic life starts right away with the core principle we've heard before. The human person must be the author, the center, and the goal of all socioeconomic life. Everything has to be judged by whether it serves human dignity.
How does it characterize the modern economy of its time?
It describes it as marked by increasing human dominion over nature, growing interdependence between people and nations, and more frequent intervention by the state. It sees the modern economy as a powerful instrument, capable of meeting the growing needs of the human family.
But like in its description of the world, it also notes significant imbalances.
Yes, stark imbalances. It highlights the huge economic disparities between wealthy nations and developing ones, calling this a threat to world peace. It points to the coexistence of luxury and misery, even within the same societies. It notes how decision-making power is often concentrated in the hands of a few, leaving many without opportunities. And it mentions disparities between different sectors like agriculture, industry, and services, and between different regions within countries.
Does it see solutions?
It acknowledges that the technical and economic possibilities exist to improve this situation, and that they can and should be used to do so. But it stresses that this requires more than just technical fixes. It demands profound changes in mentality and attitudes from everyone involved.
How does it view the roles of individuals versus the state in directing the economy?
It argues that economic development shouldn't be left solely to the kind of automatic processes of individual economic activity, nor should it be solely in the hands of the state. It explicitly condemns both theories that would oppose necessary reforms in the name of a false sense of liberty, and theories that would sacrifice fundamental personal and group rights for the sake of collectivizing production.
So, a middle path.
It emphasizes balance and responsibility. Citizens have both a right and a duty to contribute to their society's progress according to their abilities. And it specifically calls out those in less developed areas who hoard their wealth uselessly or emigrate purely for personal gain without contributing back, saying they gravely endanger the common good.
It calls for actively addressing the severe inequalities.
Urgently, it stresses the need to eliminate excessive economic inequalities and every form of social or cultural discrimination. It calls for specific attention to farmers, ensuring they receive help with production and marketing, support for necessary reforms, and a fair income, along with proper training.
What about people moving for work, migration?
It addresses the increased mobility linked to economic development, urging that migration be regulated to prevent insecurity for individuals and families. It condemns discrimination against migrant workers in wages or working conditions, insisting they be treated as persons, not just tools of production. They should be helped to bring their families, find housing, and integrate into the community. And ideally, efforts should be made to create employment opportunities in their home regions.
What does it say about work conditions themselves, especially with changing industries like automation starting then?
It insists that in adapting to new industrial patterns, society must ensure sufficient suitable employment for everyone, provide necessary technical and professional training, and guarantee people's livelihood and dignity. Special consideration must be given to those facing particular difficulties, like the sick or elderly.
And the nature of work itself.
It strongly affirms that human labor is more important than other economic factors, which are merely instruments. Work proceeds from the person, puts a kind of human seal on creation, provides for one's family, builds relationships, allows for charity, and lets us participate in God's own creative work. Work offered to God in the right spirit can even unite us with Christ's redemptive suffering and resurrection.
It sounds like it condemns organizing work in ways that harm workers.
Very strongly. It calls it unjust and inhuman to organize work systems primarily for profit in ways that reduce workers to being mere slaves to their labor. It states flatly that fundamental economic laws do not justify conditions that undermine human dignity. Work processes must adapt to the needs of the person and their other responsibilities like family life, age, and sex. Workers must have opportunities to develop their talents through their work. And adequate rest and leisure time are essential for cultivating family, cultural, social, and religious life.
What about conflicts between labor and management?
It advocates for seeking peaceful solutions to conflicts. Honest negotiation between parties is presented as the primary way. However, it also recognizes the strike as a potentially necessary, though ultimate, resort for workers to defend their rights and achieve just demands, but emphasizes that dialogue and reconciliation should always be sought quickly.
A really central principle mentioned earlier is the universal destination of goods. How does that play out here?
It's absolutely fundamental to the economic vision. The document reiterates, God intended the earth and everything in it for the use of all human beings and peoples. This principle requires that justice and charity moderate how goods are owned and used. Everyone has the right to possess a sufficient amount of property for themselves and their family.
How strictly is that interpreted?
It quotes church fathers quite pointedly, saying owners are obliged to help the poor, not just from their surplus wealth, but from their substance. And it even states that if someone is in extreme necessity, they have the right to take what they need from the riches of others. It laments the widespread hunger in the world and urges individuals and authorities to remember the saying attributed to St. Ambrose, "Feed the man dying of hunger, because if you have not fed him, you have killed him." The call is to share and use resources actively to enable people and nations to help and develop themselves.
So this principle puts limits on private property rights.
It shapes how property rights are understood. The document does affirm the right to private property and other forms of ownership. It sees these as contributing to personal expression, providing opportunities for economic function, offering space for personal and family autonomy, acting as a condition for civil liberties, and providing a source of security, including non-material security, like professional skills.
So private ownership is okay, even good.
Yes, but it immediately adds qualifications. Private ownership doesn't conflict with various forms of public ownership, which can also serve the common good. If the state needs to acquire private property, nationalization, it must serve the common good, stay within legal limits, and provide just compensation. And crucially, government has a duty to prevent the misuse of private property in ways that harm the common good.
And the most crucial point seems to be the social nature of property.
Exactly. It states very clearly that private property, by its very nature, has an intrinsic social quality, which is based on that underlying principle that goods are meant for all. If this social dimension is ignored, it leads to greed and serious disorder, and, the document notes, gives opponents of private property a plausible pretext for attacking it.
Does it apply this specifically to land ownership? That's often a contentious issue.
Yes, it addresses land reform directly, especially in developing areas where large, underutilized estates exist alongside landless peasants or those with tiny plots. It condemns situations where laborers or tenants receive inadequate wages or shares, live in poor housing, are exploited by intermediaries, lack job security, and are effectively kept in servitude, preventing their cultural, social, or political participation.
What reforms does it urge?
It calls for reforms to ensure higher income, better working conditions, social security, support for self-employment, and specifically the distribution of land to those who can make it productive. This should include providing necessary tools, education, and support for cooperatives. And again, if expropriation is necessary, just compensation must be paid.
Finally, what's the specific call to Christians involved in economic life?
They are called to be champions of justice and charity in their economic and social activities. By doing so, they offer a great service to humanity and peace. They should provide an outstanding example, individually and collectively, striving to maintain true human values even while deeply engaged in worldly affairs. They need to remain faithful to Christ and the gospel, allowing their entire lives to be permeated by the spirit of the Beatitudes, especially the spirit of poverty.
That's a remarkably comprehensive framework for economic life, isn't it? Firmly grounding it in human dignity, social responsibility, and a call to justice. As you think about your own work, your possessions, how you participate in the economy, how do these principles challenge or maybe inform your perspective? especially ideas like the social nature of property or the call to service.
Yeah, it really pushes beyond seeing economics as just, transactions and efficiency. It frames it as a deeply moral landscape where our actions have consequences for the dignity and well-being of others. And this concern for the common good, for justice, naturally scales up from the economic sphere to the political sphere.
Which brings us neatly to political life. How does Gaudium et Spes view the existence of the state, of political structures? Are they inherently good, bad, neutral?
It sees political structures, when based on law and allowing participation, as consistent with human nature. They provide a necessary framework for citizens to participate in public life and contribute to the common good. The political community exists for the sake of the common good. That's where it finds its full justification and meaning, and that's the basis for its legitimate independence. It sees the political community and public authority as founded on human nature, and therefore part of the order established by God.
So the state has a positive, even divinely ordained purpose.
Yes, but with important caveats. The specific choice of government systems and leaders is left to the free will of citizens. Political authority, whether in the community as a whole or in its institutions, must operate within the limits of the moral order. It must always be directed towards the common good, viewed dynamically. It must follow legitimately established laws. And citizens, in turn, are bound in conscience to obey legitimate authority. This highlights the responsibility, dignity, and importance of those who govern.
So different forms of government are okay.
Yes, the concrete forms can vary, but they must always serve the purpose of forming citizens who are cultured, peaceful, and benevolent towards others, ultimately for the benefit of the whole human family.
And citizen participation is crucial.
Very strongly emphasized. The document insists that political structures must offer all citizens, without discrimination, effective opportunities to participate freely and actively in establishing the legal foundations of the state, governing it, determining the aims and scope of institutions, and electing leaders. It stresses that all citizens have both the right and the duty to use their free vote to further the common good. And it praises those who dedicate themselves to public service, bearing its burdens for the good of all.
Does it acknowledge that sometimes government needs to intervene more directly in society?
Yes, it recognizes that complex modern situations often require government intervention in social, economic, and cultural matters. The goal of this intervention should be to create conditions more favorable for individuals and groups to pursue human well-being more freely and effectively. It notes that the relationship between this kind of socialization and personal autonomy can be understood differently in different regions. But it adds an important caution. If citizens' rights are temporarily restricted for the common good, freedom should be restored as soon as circumstances change.
And it specifically warns against certain forms of political rule.
Yes, it explicitly states that it is inhuman when political power takes on totalitarian or dictatorial forms that injure the rights of persons or social groups.
What about the specific role of Christians in politics? Is there a particular calling?
The document speaks of a specific vocation for Christians in the political realm. Their example should shine, demonstrating how authority can coexist with freedom, how personal initiative can harmonize with the needs of the whole social body, and how necessary unity can be combined with fruitful diversity. Christians should recognize and respect the different legitimate opinions that fellow citizens hold about temporal affairs, even when organizing in political parties. Political parties, it insists, must promote what they judge is required for the common good, never prioritizing their own private interests over it.
This sounds like it requires significant preparation.
Absolutely. The document stresses the intense need for civic and political education, especially for young people, so that all citizens can play their part responsibly. And those with a talent for politics should prepare themselves for it, practicing this difficult yet noble art without seeking personal gain or advantage. They should fight against injustice, oppression, arbitrary domination, and intolerance with integrity and wisdom.
A really crucial point in many societies is the relationship between the church and the state. How does Gaudium et Spes define that?
It states very clearly that the political community, the state, and the church are mutually autonomous and independent of each other in their own spheres.
Independent, okay, but totally separate.
Not entirely separate in practice, because both, though on different levels, are devoted to the personal and social vocation of the same individuals. The document argues that this service to people will be more effective for the good of all if both church and state practice sounder cooperation, taking into account the specific circumstances of time and place. It reminds us that humans aren't limited to the temporal order. We're citizens of two cities with a call to eternal life.
So, how does the church contribute positively to the political sphere from its perspective?
It contributes primarily by preaching the gospel truth, by illuminating all fields of human activity with its doctrine and the witness of its faithful members. By doing this, it promotes justice and charity within nations and between nations. It explicitly says the church respects and fosters the political freedom and responsibility of citizens.
And what does the church need from the state? What about its own freedom?
The church doesn't place its hope in privileges offered by civil authority. It says it will even give up the exercise of certain legitimate rights if using them might cast doubt on the sincerity of its witness, or if new conditions require different arrangements. But, it insists, the church must always and everywhere have true freedom. Freedom to preach the faith, to teach its social doctrine, to carry out its mission among people without hindrance, and crucially, freedom to pass moral judgments, even on matters relating to politics, whenever fundamental human rights or the salvation of souls require it. And in doing all this, it must use only those means which are consistent with the gospel and the welfare of all.
That's a very clear delineation of roles, distinct spheres, but potential for cooperation, grounded in the church's fundamental mission and freedom. As you think about your own involvement or perspective on political life, how do these principles, the purpose of the state serving the common good, the responsibility of citizens, the autonomy yet potential cooperation of religious and civil spheres, how might they inform your actions or views?
Yeah, it definitely frames political engagement not just as a power struggle, but as a moral endeavor aimed at the common good, demanding both wisdom and integrity from everyone involved. And this concern for justice and well-being within nations naturally extends to the global stage, bringing us to the urgent topic of peace.
Right. Moving to the final major thematic section, peace and the international community. The document places huge importance here, really recognizing the gravity of war in the modern age.
Immense importance. It states plainly that the time was marked by the cruelty and misery of war and the constant threat of it. Humanity, it says, is at a critical point, recognizing its growing unity, but facing the immense task of building a truly human world for everyone, everywhere. This demands a renewed focus on achieving true peace, and it connects this directly to the gospel message, declaring the peacemakers blessed. The document explicitly aims to explain the nature of peace, condemn the savagery of war, and urge cooperation to build peace based on justice and love.
So, what is peace, according to Gaudium at Spes? It's clearly more than just stopping the fighting.
Crucially, yes. It states peace is not merely the absence of war. It's not simply maintaining a balance of power between enemies, and it's not brought about by dictatorial rule. Instead, it defines peace, quoting the prophet Isaiah, as the fruit of justice.
The fruit of justice.
Yes, peace is the result of that order which God himself planted in human society, an order that needs to be brought into reality by people constantly striving for more perfect justice.
And it's not a one-time achievement.
No, because the common good is dynamic and historical circumstances change, peace is never attained once and for all. It must be constantly built up. And because human will is unsteady and wounded by sin, achieving peace requires constant self-control from individuals and unceasing vigilance from authorities.
How does this relate to the peace offered by Christ?
Earthly peace, when born from love of neighbor, is seen as an image and a result of the peace of Christ himself. Christ reconciled all people to God through his cross, destroying hatred in his own flesh, and after his resurrection, he poured the Spirit of love into human hearts. Therefore, Christians are urgently called to live out the truth in love and join with truly peaceful people in pleading for and building peace.
But it remains realistic about the ongoing threat of war.
Yes, it acknowledges that as long as the danger of war persists, and there's no competent international authority with sufficient power, governments cannot be denied the right to legitimate defense, provided all peaceful negotiation efforts have failed. However, even in acknowledging this right, it stresses the seriousness of the decision and the limits.
What are those limits?
It reminds everyone of the permanent binding force of universal natural law and its principles. Actions or commands that violate these laws are criminal, and blind obedience offers no excuse. It specifically condemns actions aimed at the methodical extermination of an entire people, nation, or ethnic minority, calling genocide a heinous crime, and praises the courage of those who openly resist such commands.
It also mentions efforts to humanize war.
Yes, it notes international agreements aimed at making war and its consequences less inhuman, like those concerning wounded soldiers or prisoners, and urges governments and experts to improve these agreements to better restrain the frightfulness of war. It also suggests it seems right that laws make humane provisions for conscientious objectors, those who refuse to bear arms for reasons of conscience as long as they agree to serve the community in some other way.
And it draws a sharp line between legitimate defense and wars of conquest.
Absolutely. While acknowledging the right to defense, it insists that government leaders responsible for this defense must conduct such grave matters soberly. Defending one's people is one thing. Seeking to subjugate other nations is entirely different. Possessing military power does not justify any and every military or political use of it. And just because war has tragically begun doesn't mean anything goes between the warring parties. Soldiers serving their country are viewed as agents of security and freedom, contributing to peace if they fulfill their duty properly.
But modern weapons introduced a whole new level of horror.
Exactly. The document confronts the horror of war magnified by modern scientific weapons. These weapons can inflict massive and indiscriminate destruction, going far beyond the bounds of legitimate defense. Their use, it warns, could result in an almost total and reciprocal slaughter of each side by the other, and possibly much more.
This reality demands a fundamental rethinking of war itself.
Explicitly. It calls for a completely new attitude, a completely new evaluation of war. People today, it says, must realize they will have to give a somber reckoning for their actions regarding war, because the course of the future depends heavily on the decisions made today.
Does it issue a specific condemnation related to these modern weapons?
Yes, citing recent popes, it makes a solemn declaration. Any act of war aimed at the indiscriminate destruction of whole cities or of extended areas along with their population is a crime against God and man himself. It merits unequivocal and unhesitating condemnation.
That's incredibly strong language.
It is, and it points out the unique danger of modern warfare. It provides those who possess these weapons with the opportunity to commit such crimes, and through an almost unstoppable chain reaction, it could drive human will towards the most atrocious decisions. It urges leaders and military commanders to ponder their immense responsibility before God and all humanity.
The document also critiques the arms race specifically.
Yes, it describes the arms race. Nations constantly increasing their stockpiles of weapons, paradoxically often justified as a way to deter potential adversaries. Many see this deterrence as the most effective way to maintain some kind of peace.
But the document calls this a false peace.
Absolutely. It states clearly that whatever one thinks of this method of deterrence, the arms race is not a safe way to preserve a steady and authentic peace. The resulting balance of terror is not a secure or true peace.
Why not?
Because the causes of war aren't eliminated. Instead, they threaten to become even graver. While huge sums are spent on new weapons, resources are diverted from alleviating the vast miseries of the modern world. International disagreements aren't truly healed. They fester and infect other parts of the world. It concludes that new approaches based on reformed attitudes are urgently needed to remove this trap.
And it issues another stark warning if humanity continues down this path.
A very stark warning. It says that unless humanity renounces the arms race, unless it overcomes its hostilities and establishes genuine agreements, it risks reaching a fatal hour where the only peace possible will be the awful peace of death. It urges using the time remaining, the respite granted from above, to recognize our responsibility and find more human ways to settle disputes. Divine providence, it says, urgently demands that we free ourselves from the age-old slavery of war.
This extreme urgency leads logically to working for prevention, for outlawing war.
Yes. The document clearly states it is our duty to strain every muscle to work for the time when all war can be completely outlawed by international consent. This, it acknowledges, requires establishing a universally recognized public authority with effective power to guarantee security, justice, and respect for rights for everyone.
And in the meantime, while waiting for such an authority,
existing international bodies must dedicate themselves energetically to studying the most effective ways to achieve general security. Peace, it insists, must be born of mutual trust between nations, not imposed on them through fear or the threat of weapons. Everyone must work to put an end to the arms race.
it acknowledges the efforts being made but calls for more.
Yes, it sees diligent studies and international conferences on peace and disarmament as important first steps. But these need to be intensified to produce practical results. And crucially, society shouldn't just rely on the efforts of a few leaders. Everyone needs to change their own mindset. We cannot let ourselves be deceived by false hope.
So it ends this section with both warning and hope.
Exactly. It repeats the warning. Unless we overcome hostility and hatred, unless we establish firm, honest agreements about universal peace, humanity risks drifting towards that catastrophic moment, despite its incredible scientific progress. But amidst this anxiety, the Church remains steadfast, offering most firm hope. It reiterates the apostolic message: now is the acceptable time for a change of heart, now is the day of salvation.
That combination of dire warning and unwavering hope is really powerful. And this naturally leads to thinking about the structures needed for this peace, the international community itself.
Right. Given the increasing closeness of global ties, the document argues that establishing an adequate structure for the universal common good of the international community is essential, especially to address issues like widespread poverty.
What kinds of needs should international institutions be addressing?
They should proactively meet various human needs, both in general social areas like ensuring food security, health, education, and employment opportunities, and in specific situations that arise, like providing development aid for growing nations, offering relief for refugees scattered across the globe, and helping migrants and their families.
Development aid gets particular attention.
Yes, development isn't just about economics. It requires fundamental education and professional training. This often necessitates the help of international experts, but they must act as helpers and cooperators, not as dominators. Material aid, while necessary, isn't enough. The rules of world trade need profound change. Wealthy nations have a duty to provide generous, disinterested aid grants, loans, investments which should be received with honor by developing nations.
Are there specific principles outlined for how this development should happen?
Yes, several key principles. A. Developing nations must take the lead, relying on their own resources, culture, and traditions, with their leaders setting an example. B. Developed nations have a serious duty to help, which requires adjusting their own mindset and material activities to foster genuine global cooperation. C. The entire international community should coordinate efforts, ensuring agreements are fair and equitable. D. While social and economic structures may need reform, nations must guard against premature technical solutions, especially those that contradict human nature or hinder development by promoting purely materialistic views. The document reminds us, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Every part of the human family possesses its own unique spiritual treasures.
Population issues are also mentioned in this international context.
Yes, the document acknowledges the great need for international cooperation regarding nations facing rapid population growth alongside other difficulties. Intensive collaboration is needed to provide and share the necessities for a proper life and education for all members of the human family. It also notes that many nations could significantly improve their standard of living with proper education, wise application of new agricultural techniques, social reform, and fairer land distribution.
What about the role of governments regarding population within their own borders?
The governments have rights and duties regarding population problems within their own territories, things like social legislation related to family life, migration, urbanization, providing information to citizens. The document calls for Catholic experts, especially in universities, to diligently study and advance all efforts related to these complex demographic issues.
Finally, what is the specific role envisioned for Christians in international affairs?
Christians are called to cooperate willingly and wholeheartedly in building an international order based on genuine respect for freedoms and universal brotherhood. This is presented as an urgent task, especially because so much of the world still suffers from poverty, a poverty in which, the document says, Christ himself is crying out. It calls it scandalous if nations with abundant wealth, often with Christian majorities, live lavishly while others lack necessities and are tormented by hunger, disease, and misery. The spirit of poverty and charity, it concludes, is the glory and witness of Christ's church.
So it's a strong call to global service and witness.
Yes. The church itself promotes peace and brotherhood based on divine and natural law by preaching the gospel and sharing God's grace. It needs to be present in the international community, fostering cooperation through its official channels and institutions, and through the sincere collaboration of believers motivated purely by a desire to serve. Christians should cultivate this will to cooperate generously with the international community within their own lives, paying special attention to educating young people in both religious and civic responsibility towards the global family.
And this extends to participating in international institutions.
Definitely. Contributing to the development of international institutions, whether existing ones or those yet to be founded, is seen as valuable work. International Catholic associations can strengthen this service by pooling resources, increasing the number of well-trained personnel and coordinating efforts, recognizing the need for joint action and consultation today. These associations play a key role in promoting a universal outlook and an awareness of belonging to the one great human family.
That's another incredibly powerful section, laying out the immense global challenges, but also calling for a response rooted in justice, charity, cooperation, and a sense of shared dignity. As you hear those urgent calls for global engagement, what responsibility do you personally feel towards global peace and development? How do those specific points about aid, trade, cooperation land with you?
Yeah, it really makes the global feel very personal, doesn't it? It
hmm
connects our individual choices and responsibilities to the need for much larger systemic change and cooperation, all grounded in this idea of a shared human identity and destiny. And this brings us full circle, really back to the role of the church itself in the midst of all these worldly realities.
Right, bringing it all together in the final section, summarizing the role of the church. So fundamentally, what is the church's relationship with the world according to Gaudium et Spes?
The core idea, right from the opening lines we mentioned, is that the church isn't separate from humanity. It's deeply involved, sharing the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of all people, especially the poor and afflicted. It exists in the world, sharing its journey. Its presence is meant to act like leaven, like a soul, for human society as it renews itself in Christ.
And what is its main contribution to the world?
While the church has its own distinct goal, the salvation of souls, the coming of God's kingdom, it also, by its very presence and activity, contributes significantly to the human world. It helps to illuminate the world with its message, heal and elevate human dignity, strengthen the bonds of society, and give deeper meaning and significance to all human activity. Through its members and its mission, it helps make the human family and its history more human.
But its primary mission remains religious, not political or economic.
Yes, the document is clear about that. The specific mission Christ gave the church is religious. It's not primarily political, economic, or social. However, and this is key out of this religious mission, flow light and strength that can help structure and consolidate the human community according to God's law. It serves humanity primarily by proclaiming the gospel and sharing God's grace through the sacraments.
And this mission works alongside that independence from the political sphere we discussed.
Exactly. It reiterates its autonomy from the political community, its independence, but it also stresses its willingness to cooperate with political authorities for the common good. It seeks the freedom it needs to preach and serve, adapting its methods as times change, even being willing to renounce certain legitimately acquired rights if using them would compromise its witness.
And throughout the document, there's been this consistent call to individual Christians. How is that summarized here?
The consistent theme is that Christians are called to live out their faith in the world. They need to faithfully fulfill their earthly duties, guided by the spirit of the gospel. They should integrate their faith with their daily lives, their family life, their professional work, their social and political engagement. It explicitly warns against the serious error of creating an artificial split between one's faith and one's actions in the world. Christians should be living examples of justice, charity, peace-building, and service in every sphere they operate in.
The document also ends with a strong emphasis on dialogue, doesn't it?
Yes, very much so. It calls for dialogue among all people. This includes dialogue with those who might acknowledge God but perhaps don't fully recognize him as creator, and even dialogue with those who oppose and persecute the church. The fundamental premise is that all people are called to be brothers and sisters, sharing the same human and divine destiny. Therefore, everyone should cooperate without violence or deceit to build up the world in genuine peace. It also expresses hope for growing unity among Christians themselves, seeing this as a potential sign of peace and concord for the whole world.
So this deep dive has really walked us through Gaudium et Spes' incredibly comprehensive vision. It analyzes the complexities of the modern world, affirms human dignity even amidst challenges, emphasizes the value of community and social structures, finds deep meaning in human activity like work and culture, lays out principles for political life, makes an urgent plea for peace and international cooperation, and all the while defines the Church's unique but deeply engaged role within it all.
It really is a remarkable perspective, profoundly theological, yet deeply engaged with the concrete realities of human life. It acknowledges progress and struggle, our highest hopes and deepest anxieties, and insists that faith has something vital to say directly to those realities.
And it makes such a compelling case that this isn't just some dusty historical text, but a living perspective that still challenges and invites participation from you, the listener. It asks you to engage with the world's challenges and opportunities, seeing them as the real-life context for living out a shared human and divine calling.
Yeah, it fundamentally challenges any idea that faith can be purely private or somehow separate from the public square. It urges this integrated life of belief and action, impacting every sphere.
The document speaks, quite movingly, about the good fruits of our earthly efforts. Things like dignity, brotherhood, freedom, being purified and found again in the new heaven and new earth. So as we finish this deep dive, perhaps here's a provocative thought to leave you with. If the very best of our human efforts here and now, our attempts to build a more just, peaceful, and truly human world, somehow carry forward, cleansed and transformed into eternity, what does that imply about the small, seemingly ordinary acts of justice, charity, and peace that we undertake each day? Do our everyday efforts to make the world just a little bit better right where we are actually possess an eternal weight and ultimate significance?
That's a question that certainly resonates deeply and invites quite a bit of reflection.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into these key excerpts from Gaudium et Spes. We really hope it's offered some valuable insights and plenty to think about.
Thank you. It's been a rich discussion. Until next time.